opportunity for me to share with you. I was just thinking as I was listening to this lovely introduction by Barbara, I spoke about a month ago in Vancouver for a school for kids that have disabilities, and the woman who's the organizer of the school, she also has dyslexia, and so when she went to send out all the notices to say that I was speaking, she got the letters of my last name a little bit mixed up, so instead of K-U-N-T-Z, she had K-N-U-T-Z. And so all these flyers went out, and then she's standing in the front of the room, and she goes to introduce me, and she looks at the sheet of paper with my name misspelled, and she's trying to think about how to pronounce it, and she couldn't quite remember. So she thought maybe the K was silent, so she introduced me as Ted Nuts. So I've learned it helps to have a little humility when you do this work. Well, Barbara's asked if I would come and share with you the journey that I've been on. I know that some of you have already heard it, so I hope that what I have to say isn't too much of a repetition for you, but rather that it's a reminder. Because I know that I need to be reminded over and over again, because it's easy to forget. And so I want to share with you the journey quickly that I've been on with my son, and then some of what I learned as a result of that journey. And I brought a picture of Josh for those that haven't had a chance to meet him yet. This is him. And I'll pass it around for those that want to take a look. And the story I want to tell you is about his first 5 years of life. When Josh was born, he was born healthy, and then at 5 months of age, his mother and I did what most parents do, is we took him to the doctors for his first vaccine shot. And unfortunately, Josh reacted to the vaccine and had a seizure of about 25 minutes long. And we went to hospital at Royal Columbian Hospital. They prescribed some anti-seizure medication, sent us on our way, and suggested to us that we just treat Josh as a normal child and everything would be fine. Well, unfortunately, everything wasn't fine, and a month later, Josh seized again, and then a month later again, a month later again. And eventually, the doctors at Royal Columbian said that Josh's condition was too complicated for them. They referred us to Vancouver Children's Hospital, and we began to work with a team of neurologists who all took a hand in trying to manage Josh's seizure disorder. And so for the next 5 years, they tried a number of medications, combinations of medications, diet, steroids. At one point, we had a device implanted into his chest cavity called a vagal nerve stimulator, wires running up his neck trying to stimulate his brain on a regular pattern. But instead of things getting better, they got worse, and the space between the seizures got shorter and shorter and shorter. And by the time Josh was 4, he was seizing 12 to 15 times a day. And each seizure was about 15 to 20 minutes long, and a seizure of that length deprives the brain of oxygen and so causes even more brain damage. And so this young son of mine, who at one point could walk and talk and feed himself and ride a tricycle and all those things, by the age of 4, he lost all of those abilities. When Josh was 5, the doctors at Children's asked us not to come back. They had said that there was nothing else they could do to improve his condition, that if his mother and I needed a break from our son, that they would admit him to hospital, that they would no longer treat him. And so I know that you can appreciate how difficult a time that was. They had warned us that any one of the seizures has the potential to kill him because of how challenging it is to him. They explained that a seizure of 20 minutes long expends as much energy as somebody running a marathon. And so Josh was running effectively 12 to 15 marathons a day. And so it was a very difficult time in all of our lives. My wife had to quit her job to become a full-time care attendant. We have a daughter, Lanny, who's 5 years older. And she got lost in all of this because there was just no space to attend to the healthy needs of a 9-year-old. And you've got a 5-year-old seizing 12 and 15 times a day. I was angry about what was happening to my son. I was afraid that he might die. I was resentful about what the medicine had done to him. And I was feeling in a place of desperation. And the crazy part is that I would go to work every day, work with other families and try to assist them to get their lives on track, and then come home to my darkness and not want to be there. Many days I didn't want to wake up in the morning. I couldn't stand to face what I was facing. And I knew that I needed to live life different. I knew I needed to climb out of this hole, but I really didn't know how to do it. The psychotherapeutic tools that I had acquired as part of my training somehow just didn't seem to make a difference. And so there were a couple of events that shifted me, and one I'll quickly go through is I went to see a psychic, and the psychic said I could come with questions. And I only had one question, and the question was, son live? And I asked my question, and the psychic responded with these words. She said, "Have no fear, the son will outlive the father as he should." And when I heard those words, this joy went racing through my heart at the possibility that Josh would survive. And a second question came to mind. And I asked, if Josh is going to live, what would he be when he grows up? And the psychic paused and then said, "Your son will be what he already is, and that is a teacher." But I have to admit that when I first heard those words from the psychic, they didn't make any sense to me. Josh now had the capacity of a 2-year-old, and it was not expected to improve. His language was reduced to about 30 or 40 words. He couldn't understand how he could become a teacher. And I don't even remember if I asked more questions from the psychic. I remember leaving with confusion about what I had heard. But what I did notice is that I began to get curious, and I thought, well, if Josh is a teacher, there must be something that he can teach me. And as I opened up to the possibilities that there was some wisdom there, it seemed like they finally started to arrive. And the first lesson came on a typical day. Josh and I shared a little ritual together. And as part of that ritual, when I drove home from work and drove up the driveway, Josh would recognize the sound of my car, and he would know that his dad was home. And if he was well enough, he would run to the window at the back of the house, and he would wait for me to get out of the car. And when I got out and looked to the window, that little face was there, and he would yell, "Hi, Dad." And I would say, "Hi, Josh." And I would come into the house. But most days when I got out of the car and looked to the window, it was empty. And it was because Josh was having too many seizures to be able to get up. And I always dreaded that empty window. On this particular day, I drove up the driveway, I parked my car, and then I looked at the window as I always did, and there was this little face in the window, his little nose pressed flat against the glass. And I just stopped just to feel the joy that I felt that he was having a good day that day. But something different happened that day, and as I was looking at my son, I heard this voice, and the voice was as if it was spoken out loud. And what I heard was a question, and the question was, when your son looks through the glass at you, what does he see? And as I thought about that question, the answer was clear. He saw a father who was angry, a father who was afraid, and a father who was effectively rejecting his own son. Because the truth was, I didn't want this disabled son of mine. I wanted the son that was in my imagination, that was there before all of this began. And when I recognized that that's who I was and that was my way of being in the world, I knew that my son deserved better. And so I remember making a very deliberate commitment to my son that day. And I said to myself, "Josh, I'm going to learn how to be happy. I'm going to learn how to be peaceful. I'm going to find my joy again. But more important, I'm going to learn to fall in love with the son that I have, not the son that's in my imagination that doesn't exist." And so I began a journey, and the journey was to find peace, to find joy, to find happiness, to find acceptance. And I began with just a very simple question. The question was, is what I'm doing, is the way I'm thinking, is the way I'm behaving, does it add to my peace, my joy, my happiness, or does it add to my anger, to my sadness, to my despair? And by simply asking that question and noticing the direction I was walking in, I came to recognize that some ways of living moved me in this direction, and other ways moved me in the direction of anger and sadness and despair. And so that was really the magic of that moment, is that I began to live life thoughtfully. I began to notice. I began to pay attention. I began to take responsibility for the direction that I was walking in. And as a result of that, I learned some very valuable things. And I learned that some ways of thinking and behaving increased my anger and despair, and other ways increased my peace and joy. And so my book is simply an attempt to try to capture what I noticed happened to me. People sometimes will ask me whether it's true for you, whether what I discovered will be the same for you, and the truth is I don't know. My invitation is to begin to pay attention to the direction that you're walking in. Is what you're doing, is your way of thinking, is your way of behaving, does it add to your joy, to your peace, to your happiness? Or does it add to your anger and sadness and despair? The Chinese have a wonderful saying. They say, unless you change your direction, you'll end up where you're headed. And what I've come to recognize, both from my own observation and from my work as a psychotherapist, is that I believe that unfortunately we've been taught the tools of anger, sadness, and despair in our culture. When I look out at the kind of messages that are being projected, when I see the themes that people come in with on a day-to-day basis, they don't recognize their power. They don't recognize their responsibility. They act as if they have no choice. And so I think that there's some relearning, some reminding that needs to happen. Because I believe we're actually very powerful people. The picture that I have hanging in my office is that classic one of Michelangelo's where the hand of God is extended to the hand of man. And the reason I have it in my office is that I believe it's a very powerful image. And what I learned was that the name of that painting is called Creation. And I believe what it represents, I'm not sure what Michelangelo had in mind, but what I take from it is that what's being extended from God to man is the power to create. That when the Bible says that we're made in the image and likeness of God, I'm not so sure it means we look like God physically, but I think what it means is that we too can create. Now, what I recognize for me is that I spent a good 40 years of my life reacting to life, not creating. And I would just bounce off things, and I would act angrily and resentfully and fearfully to things that showed up in my life. And it was a hard way to live. And as a result of my observation about what was working or what wasn't working, I began to recognize that there are tools of creation. There are tools of taking ownership of your life. In the counseling field, one of the questions that we ask is we say, who's driving your bus? And the metaphor is around, we think that life is like a bus, and the observation that I have in working with many clients is that they're sitting in a passenger seat complaining about where the bus is going. And the work of the therapist is to invite them to sit into the driver's seat and actually drive the bus. Now, when I identified the number of ways of thinking that would lead me in the direction of anger, sadness, and despair, I'll quickly just walk through those because I think it's important for us to begin to recognize how we give away our power, how we don't drive our bus. And what I noticed is that I did a number of things. One is that when I was uncertain about the future, I would imagine all the worst possible outcomes. And when I did that, I suffered. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, and I discovered that your body doesn't distinguish between a real event and an imagined event. And so when you imagine all those negative things, you actually put yourself through serious suffering. Medicine is getting clearer and clearer that many of us think ourselves sick by the kind of thoughts that we have. Research tells us the average North American has 9 times as many negative thoughts as positive thoughts. Mark Twain has a quote I really like. He says, I've had a very difficult life. Fortunately, most of it didn't happen. So I've learned that the imagination is a very powerful tool, and I can use it positively or negatively. But I recognize I spent most of my life using it negatively, seeing what I didn't want to have happen. The second way of thinking that I notice is that I would say, I don't want to, but I have to. I have no choice. And I observe in our culture that that's a very common theme. It's typical if you turn on a radio or TV to hear a politician say, well, we had no choice but to raise taxes. The CEO of a company will say, we had no choice but to lay off 400 employees. And so when they act like they have no choice, and we perceive them as being the leaders of our community, it's not surprising we too come to believe that we have no choice. I would say things like, it shouldn't be this cold at this time of year in Vancouver. Vancouver should have won the hockey game the other night. That car accident should never have happened. My son should never have been damaged by that vaccine shot. I would make all of these statements that were actually resisting reality, resisting what is. And when I would resist it, I would get angry, I would get frustrated, I would get discouraged, I would feel resentful or powerless. And yet the events already happened. And so resisting it didn't change them, but it changed me into somebody who was struggling. I would think I had made a mistake, and as a result of those mistakes, I would be fearful, and I would be cautious, and I would be ashamed. And yet, when I began to examine that, what I recognized was that in each and every moment, I actually made the best decision that was available to me. And so I've learned to look at that differently. I recognized as a result of the work of Eckhart Tolle that I spent very little time here, that I was always in my imagined future, or I was remembering my past, that I was not here for this moment. And I began to realize that the only time I showed up was when I would first get into a hot tub, and I would go, oh, that feels good. And then about 30 seconds later, my mind would be off again someplace myself. And so I was almost never here. I recognized that I would say things like, I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when the weekend comes. I'll be happy when holidays come. I'll be happy when my house gets paid off. I'll be happy when I get married. I'll be happy when I get divorced. And so I noticed that I kept projecting happiness into my future, but I never actually claimed it in this moment. I always had conditions about what I needed. But again, I wasn't surprised when you turn on the radio, TV, newspaper, every advertisement has embedded within it a message that says you'll be happy when you have this. And so it's not surprising we buy into these stories. The problem is those stories take us down the path of anger, sadness, despair, resentment, powerlessness. And so then I began to look for ways of thinking, ways of behaving that would walk me in a different direction. And what I noticed is not anything that I've discovered. I've simply noticed messages that are already out there, and some of it has been around for thousands of years, but we have lost them or forgotten them or dismissed them. The first tool that I really came to understand was the power of the imagination, to see in my mind's eye what I want to have happen. The Secret has done a wonderful job of spreading that message around. I learned that if you want to create something, two actions are necessary: intention and attention. Intention is, what do I intend? What does it look like? What outcome do I want to have happen? And attention is, where do I focus my awareness? Where do I focus my energy? What am I looking at? One of the small metaphors that I talk about in my book that I find very helpful is, I had a client that worked in the Molson Indy in the race car event that was in Vancouver, and he talked about how race car drivers are trained. And he said they're trained that if the car goes out of control and starts to head towards a wall, not to look at the wall, but instead to look for an opening in the field of cars. And if the driver does that, the car moves towards the opening. But if he looks at the wall, he'll crash through it every time. And so I began to use that as a good metaphor for life. When I was in a crisis, was I looking at the walls or the openings? The barriers or the possibilities? And what I noticed was, as I began to look for the openings, for the possibilities, I would move in that direction. And so where we focus our attention is very powerful. I learned to immerse myself in the present moment. My commitment to myself is to be here about 80% of the time. Seems like a good place to start. I learned to recognize that I have choice. And so when I would catch myself with this phrase, I have no choice, I would know that that's not a true statement. But the truth is that I always have possibilities before me. And it was one of those events where that voice showed up again. And I'll tell you the story quickly. It was when my daughter was 14, she decided not to come home at 10 o'clock at night, which was her curfew, and instead to come home at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I spent those 6 hours imagining all these things I was going to do to my daughter. But somewhere just before 4 o'clock, that voice showed up and said, Ted, of all those things, what would do the most good? And I have to admit somewhat humbly that it's the first time I consciously thought of that question. What would do the most good? And what I came to recognize in that few moments of reflection is that the way I had lived my life is whatever emotion had the most intensity, what I call the highest score, is what I expressed. And so if my anger was the highest, I was angry. If disappointment was the highest, I was disappointed. And so when I thought about what would do the most good with my daughter when she got home, what I came to realize is that probably what would do the most good was to tell her that I loved her, I was glad that she was home safe, and I cared about her. And so that's what I did. Shortly after that, she came in the door, and I think the universe was whispering to her, saying, don't go home yet, Dad's not ready. And so she came in the door, and she looked at me with these eyes, and I gave her a big hug, and I said, Lanny, I'm glad you're safe, I'm glad you're home, and I love you. And she backed up from me like this, and she went, okay, what did you do with my dad? And I say that with some humor, but I also say it with regret, because what she was saying was that's not the way I was with her for many years. She would have been more used to her father being angry with her, disciplining her, telling her how disappointed or hurt I was by her behavior. And so I learned that question, what will do the most good, is a very powerful way of moving into the world. And I began to recognize that when I acted from that place, that the world felt like a canvas, that I got to paint this picture. instead of just being in the world but not being of it, bouncing off of things like a billiard ball, I felt like I was actually directing the course of my life in a way that I felt like I was an agent of change, an agent of love, an agent of peace. And it's a joyful way to live life when you actually feel like this is an act of creation. Because one of the things that I've learned is one of the most joyful things we do is to create. And if you can create every day, life is filled with joy. I learned to breathe through my diaphragm. I learned to schedule my worry time. I learned to notice that pain is in me, is communicating something important to me, and it's often telling me that I'm not living in a healthy or sustainable way. And so I can either medicate the pain with something, or I can honor it and say, tell me about that. And so I started to live more thoughtfully, more consciously. And what I can say is that I feel like I've been successful in honoring my son. I have gotten to the place of being peaceful and joyful. And it's not because he's changed, it's because I've changed. Many people ask about how Josh is. Josh is 22 now. He still has an uncontrolled seizure disorder. He still has the capacity of a 2-year-old. But I'm very grateful to him for the experience that he's made available to me, because out of that I have learned to find my peace and my joy, and I have had the opportunity to help other people find their peace and their joy. And I look at the world today, and I believe that the most important thing is for us to find peace. We all want peace, and I believe we don't really know how to do it. And so we need to discover the tools of peacemaking, and then we need to teach it. One of the things that I say in my book, and I learned from my experience at Douglas College, is that simply giving information to people is mostly a waste of time, because they forget most of it after about 2 months. But if you take some of the ideas that you've heard and you begin to tell other people about it, teach other people, helps you retain 90% of the information. And so I would like all of you to go out and take something that you've heard today and share it, because through the sharing, you retain more of it and somebody else learns some wisdom about peacemaking. I believe the opportunity to be a peacemaker is one of the most precious gifts that we can hold right. I want to end with a story that I begin the book with, and it's not my story, it's a story that I came across that I found very powerful, and maybe you already know it, or those that have heard me speak know it, because I share it wherever I go. And it's a native story, and I love how they capture deep wisdom so simply. And it's a conversation between a grandfather and his grandson, and the two are walking down a path in silence. And after a while, the grandfather interrupts the silence and says, "Grandson, there are 2 wolves fighting in my heart. And one wolf is angry, vindictive, and wants to hurt others. And the other wolf is kind and compassionate and loving." And the grandson hears the words of his grandfather, and he has some fear about that, and he says to his grandfather, "Grandfather, which wolf will win the battle of your heart?" And the wise elder says, "My heart will be won by the wolf that wins the battle of every man's heart. It's the wolf that I feed." And so it's important for us to notice which wolf we're feeding. But I also believe if we don't know how to feed the positive wolf, it's hard to do. So I hope I've given you some thoughts. I hope Josh has been a teacher to you today. Thank you.